So for those of you who've kind of poked around the website already in terms of some of the materials that are available to you, there's a video from last year from our director at the time, Ron Linden, who talks about Europe's crises and frames it in terms of these existential threats to Europe. And you hear actually a fair amount about the existential threats to Europe. And so I'm taking a different turn on this, and I wanted to present it from after these kinds of crises had kind of come to a head last June, while in fact we were all on the Brussels trip, last year's Brussels trip. And I want to talk a little bit about what I see as opportunities and rather than crises. And so I tentatively have titled it Reforging Europe, with the idea that reforging something can make it stronger, and thinking about how Europe has responded to all the crises that you have no doubt heard about in the news of late. Now, for those of you who've been paying attention, the EU just turned 60. Happy birthday, EU. They celebrated in Rome in March the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Rome, which was signed by the original 6 European Economic Community members. And they have since grown from 6 to 28, and shortly 27. There's attrition apparently. But what has been brought up in this recent years, and in thinking about the Treaty of Rome and what's happened since, is what are the defining characteristics of the European Union? It starts out as this kind of economic partnership, and what is it now? What has it grown into? And of course, the big shared thing is the single market, the free movement of goods and people. But there's also a lot of talk about shared values. Some people call for an ever closer union. Is that the goal? Is European Union to become ever closer union? Is it moving to something that's more federal, like the United States of Europe? Is it about fiscal union? Is the euro the way of the future? Or is that actually just going to keep kind of stagnant or maybe dissolve on its own someday? These things have all been kind of tried and tested in the challenges that we've seen hit since 2008. First with the global financial crisis that was seen in, it hit the United States, but it really hit Europe. And it came out in many ways, but and it was played out in many parts of Europe. And since then, in 2015, we had the migration crisis. And then, of course, there were these fears that rising populism was going to lead to the people voting to leave the EU, which happened last June when British voters voted in a referendum to part ways with the EU, which we all know as Brexit. And now, of course, people talk about where does Europe stand with the other great kind of seismic shock that Europe felt in last year, which was in November with the US elections, which they had not anticipated the victory of Donald Trump. And his administration has been a kind of unpredictable variable for them, trying to figure out where they would stand in a new transatlantic relationship. But my thought is that troubles have a way of helping people figure out their core values. And I think for Europe, it's going to be the same thing. This is a unique opportunity for the EU to move forward and become even stronger. My predecessor last year presented a slightly bleak picture of what was facing Europe, and most people were talking that way. I was talking that way last year. But I'm much more optimistic for Europe this year. If last year Europe faced several existential crises, this year I think they're starting to feel up to the challenges in some ways that they are maybe conflicted about, but I think I'm starting to see a more emboldened Europe. What I see happening is a strengthening of European identity. Now, I may be wrong, we'll see, but I'm seeing a strengthening of European identity as the EU negotiates this series of challenges. And it was kind of important to remember as you think about what I'm about to say, and you all know this in thinking about identity, and many of you probably have contacts with middle school and high school students, which they're always thinking about how they define themselves, right, and their identity. And so it's as much defined by what you are, the things you love, the things you do, the things you believe in, as by what you are not, right, the other that you define yourself against. So let's think of these various crises. I'm just going to pick out a few of them, the ones that have been kind of most talked about. First, Brexit, where we left off last year when you watched that video. The referendum happened in June. It happened on our last Brussels study trip. It was very nice of them to coordinate it that way because it was a very powerful moment for our teachers. We spent the week meeting with people who were all preparing us for how important this Brexit vote was, and then everybody kind of stayed up, and then the morning, the first thing they did was turned on the TV to look for the results, and everybody was shocked that the results came back to vote to leave the European Union. But then it led to uncertainty. What was next? And of course, if you followed it, it was just one big announcement after the other. The prime minister resigns, there's a shakeup, this person was stabbed in the back, that person came up, and finally, out of the ashes emerged Theresa May. But there are a lot of questions left to resolve. First, it had to get going. So there was this Article 50, right? It was talked about. Were they going to trigger Article 50? Never had the Treaty of Lisbon been so understood, that one article, as after Brexit, when suddenly everybody was asking, when are they going to trigger Article 50? Article 50. Well, on March 29th, just this past couple months, Theresa May officially triggered Article 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon. Now, that's the article within the treaty that gives any EU member the right to unilaterally quit the EU. And it lays out, it's pretty brief, it basically lays out that there's 2 years and the terms have to be negotiated within 2 years after Article 50 is invoked. So I give you this because I'm a historian, so I like historical artifacts. This is the letter that she had delivered to President Tusk on March 29th. And if you have time, go back to this and pull up, and we'll put the slides on, and you'll have this presentation. And go ahead and read it, and I think it's a great example of sort of diplomacy, but it talks about common values. It talks about what we're really saying no to. It doesn't mean we're rejecting you. It's not you, it's us. I mean, it's very much a kind of breakup letter, but it's an interesting diplomatic breakup letter. Now, this invoking Article 50 means they now have 2 years, effectively, to negotiate the exit. That's much more complicated than it might sound. This is going to be a pretty messy divorce, I think. The negotiations have to be taken between Britain and each of the 27 member states. The member states will all have to approve. Then it's going to have to be formally approved by a majority, and then it's probably also going to have to be approved at the level of the national parliaments, and in some cases the subnational parliaments. So that's a lot. It's going to be quite a process. And one wonders what the relationship with the EU is going to look like. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about whether this would be a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit. The idea behind that would be a hard Brexit would be they leave entirely. They have no access to the single market. The soft Brexit would be they negotiate something along the lines of what other countries have done, like Switzerland, for example. That's not very likely because one of the main qualms they had was the free movement of people. And the EU has made it pretty clear, they're taking a pretty hard line on it. If you want access to the single market, you need to accept the free movement of people. So they're pretty much going to force a hard exit. And Theresa May said, yeah, it's going to be a hard exit. But then the EU is also thinking strategically, right? If we let them off easy, will others want to leave too? But if we're too hard on them, how do we negotiate a relationship afterwards? If the divorce is too messy, are we really going to be able to continue to work together? Because there's a lot of things that they still have in common. The EU negotiators, some people have harder feelings than others. But I think they're treating this like a divorce where they're still going to have to raise kids together afterwards. the EU negotiators have kind of thrown out this number that they're going to think that Britain is on the hook for 60 billion euros worth of already pledged spending and pensions for people who work from Britain in the EU. Britain will probably stomp around and say that's too much, but they might want to just go ahead and give up on that one because they want to get to the big issues, and we'll see what some of the other big issues are. So it'll be really interesting to watch how that relationship develops, how that dance is played. And of course, what Theresa May really wants in the end of this, after Brexit, is a comprehensive free trade deal between the UK and the EU. And the likelihood of that being accomplished in 2 years is pretty slim. So we're going to have to see how the breakup looks, and then they'll have to start negotiating the trade deal. And those big kinds of comprehensive free trade deal negotiations take years as well. So this is an ongoing process. The other big question marks, the big hurdles, are those involving the UK domestic scene. Political unity. The vote for Brexit was by a fairly slim margin. A lot of people are upset about it. Many Britons feel that it's probably the worst decision that their country's made in a really long time. And others are elated about it and think that this is finally they're back on course. So how do you bring back that kind of unity in a fairly fractured polity? And so there's been some steps taken. Theresa May clearly thinks that she needs a better sort of measure of consensus. So she's called for the snap elections, which happen next week. So stay tuned. But it should be a pretty predictable result. My political scientist friends, who I will say lately have been wrong more than they've been right, but but they were right recently, so I'm going to give them credit. Assure me that it'll be a strong, as Theresa May has predicted, and probably the reason she called them, it'll be a strong return for her party. The Conservatives will show a kind of united front, and she'll have that kind of mandate that she wants to move forward with the negotiations. But there's also the unity in terms of territorial questions. Scotland's a huge sticking point now. They've already called for a second referendum on Scottish independence. Scotland wants access to the single market. Scotland did not vote to leave the European Union in general. And so the idea of a possible Scottish independence is a renewed threat. The British thought that they had sort of skirted that problem before Brexit. And it looks like it could get really interesting. There was always the thought that Scotland wouldn't have a chance to get to the EU because countries like Spain would veto their entrance if they became independent, because Spain has its own problems with separatist movements. But Spain's actually already said, we won't stand in your way, Scotland, if you become independent. We won't stand in your way of becoming an EU member. So things are getting interesting. And of course, there's also the issue of the border in Ireland. The border between North Ireland and the Republic of Ireland will be the only land border between the UK and the EU. The Irish peace process was largely bolstered by the EU and has, really only been sort of strongly in place since 1998. That's not a long time. So there's some worries about what might happen there, and people are starting to talk about, well, could Ireland reunite? So again, interesting times. As a side note, this Brexit has also made a very interesting predicament where the language most commonly spoken in the EU in doing business, as you will see when you go to Brussels, is definitely English. But the only English-speaking member state is soon to be Ireland. So it's a very odd predicament that we're facing. And then finally, uncertainty is not something that markets love, that businesses and investors love, and Brexit is unprecedented. No one has ever left the European Union before, so we're not really sure what it's going to look like. They don't really know how it's going to play out. And the UK is pretty big, right? So uncertainty is not people's favorite thing when they move forward on investments and thinking about where they're going to build their businesses. So that's another problem that Theresa May and that the EU has to contend with coming up. But on Europe's side, if they can weather this, I think they're going to be stronger at the end of it. In going through this process, they're going to have to determine what are those essential characteristics of EU membership that they're not willing to give up on. And for the most part, when they've given up on some of these things and they're negotiating their special relationships with Norway, with Switzerland, it was low stakes. These are not big power players, right? When Britain leaves, they have to really think, what does it mean to be an EU member? You cannot have the perks of membership if you're not willing to take on the burden of the responsibilities of membership, like the free movement of peoples. Also, I think Europe has rallied a little bit, and polls have shown that confidence in the EU has at least plateaued. It was steadily declining up until Brexit, until the Brexit referendum, and since the financial crisis. Confidence in the EU had been kind of steadily on the decline. It's now plateaued, and people who were kind of starting to question whether they wanted to be members, a lot of them have backed off on that. Perhaps they're just waiting, or maybe they are starting to see, wait, the Brits may have made a huge mistake here. So a lot of it, I think, will depend upon how negotiations work. But life after Britain leaves may not be so bad. Already elections in the Netherlands in March and in France in May returned victory for candidates who were pro-Europe, and returned losses, like pretty surprising hard losses, at least in the case of the Netherlands, debatable in France, for the candidate who was the most Eurosceptic and populist. I mean, she did well in the first round, so it's hard to say it was a real loss for her, but I think if this continues, if this kind of sense of, well, there may be problems with EU membership, but it's better than not, if this sense of European identity as being defined by who doesn't want to be a part of the EU anymore may make the EU a little stronger in the end. So got cut off a little bit. And now we're going to turn to our second big challenge, which is the migration, refugees, and part of all this that kind of gets lost in it is the demographic crises that we're facing in this world. So as you know, in 2015, there was a huge migration. Well, what was being billed as a migration crisis or a refugee crisis, but maybe it was really a crisis of reception. But we can talk about that later, and you'll talk a little bit about that probably when you're in Brussels. As you can see from these charts, which I have given you the citations for, in case you ever want to use them. In 2015, there were 1,321,560 total asylum claims for EU countries. Most in, as you can see by the size of the dots, Germany, Sweden, Hungary, Italy, Austria, and France. More than 1 million of those migrants arrived by sea from Syria and East and West Africa. And you can see kind of the routes by which people were coming, and still are in some cases. But things have changed a little since then. Some of the crisis was abated when in spring of 2016, the EU negotiated a deal with Turkey that closed the Balkan route to migrants coming along from that end, as you can see by the big blue kind of X marks the spot. And so that closed that Balkan route. And in 2016, according to Frontex, which is a European Service for Border Control, approximately 364,000 migrants reached Europe by sea. So that's about a third of 2015. It's a huge decrease. But there's still signs of what's coming, of what the crisis could still look like if we kind of look forward, look ahead. Because while the numbers of refugees coming from Syria and Afghanistan dropped by 80% in 2016 as compared to 2015, the number of migrants from West Africa rose by 20% in that same period. This is likely just the beginning, as Europe is very well aware, and if you talk to people, and you will talk to people in Brussels, they're well aware of this. If you look at this map from the Pew Research Center, this shows the projected annual growth rate of populations across the world. But the interesting part is to look at Africa and then look at Europe. In Europe, you either have steady, stagnant, like replaceable, natural deaths, natural births keep up with each other. Or you have negative, where the natural birth rate is not going to keep up with population losses from death. So that's the problem in Europe. They have this demographic crisis in that direction. But in Africa, we have this huge population growth, and every time the experts look at it, it becomes more sort of eye-opening and more unpredictable, because African fertility is not decreased. People are having more kids, and that's not stopping. And so population is becoming is largely unsustainable, and the growth is certainly unsustainable. So people are going to need to either make things better for where they are, or they're going to want to move, right? The push factors are going to push them somewhere. And Europe is well aware of the fact that they are the most politically stable and the most economically strong neighbor. And so a lot of people are going to want to move to Europe. So this presents a challenge. And this has led to what we've been seeing is, sorry, I don't mean that one yet. What we've been seeing is a kind of crisis in European identity that's been played out, I think, pretty well in the press, in popular movies, in TV. We see it in politics with the rise of populist, anti-immigration, nationalist movements, like the Front National in France, Geert Wilders' party in the Netherlands, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, the Pegida movement in Italy, in Greece. And you see people really questioning, what does it mean to be French? What does it mean to be Dutch? What does it mean to be German? What does it mean to be European? I would argue that this is both a crisis of religious identity, when you look at how Europe responds to sort of migrants who come through who are Muslim, but also how Europe has dealt with Turkey's candidacy to the EU. And we can talk about that later. We don't really have time here, but if you have questions in the post, I can address that. So it's a little bit of a crisis of religious identity. Does being Christian have something to do with being Europe? But it's also a crisis of whiteness. Does being European have something to do with whiteness? And that's, I think, getting debated ever more these days, and sometimes more openly than Europeans are used to. So I put this up as a kind of, Europeans are used to thinking, at least the European Union is used to defining cultural diversity as this kind of national diversity. So, you think of the ethnic garb of different parts of Europe, right? The old German lederhosen. I don't know why a beefeater would be the thing from Europe, from England, but whatever. The French mime and the French guy with the baguette on his bicycle. These kind of essentialized images of what it means to be a European national citizen are defined by which country you're at, and maybe the local identities of the regional identity, like Breton or Catalan. But could cultural diversity start to mean something in Europe more like what it means in the United States, is kind of multiculturalism. And oddly enough, it's really hard to find pictures in Europe that depict that in the way that we kind of picture them, maybe on like college catalogs that are trying to project kind of diversity. So the way that it kind of comes off kind of graphically in Europe is people not having color, but just being flags. So it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how they contend with these issues. Europe doesn't have a history. European scholars do talk about race, but they don't have the same history of talking about race that Americans do. So it'll be interesting to watch them contend with what this means, what these notions mean as we move forward. I think that's probably the biggest challenge that Europe's going to be facing coming forward, the most kind of crisis for them. What does it mean to be European? But it also has great promise. If the EU and its member states figure out how to better integrate migrants, if they move towards a genuinely common migration and asylum policy that they can all agree upon, and if they promote openness and diversity in new ways that make it part of like culture of Europe and those core values they're defending, then they could very well become a more resilient union. European identity, thus, could be strengthened not just by thinking about those who don't any longer want to be a part of Europe, but in thinking about how to welcome those who do want to be a part of the European Union. So I'm going to have to do this part quickly because I've taken more time than I was supposed to. But the last big challenge, of course, is the economy. And I'm going to lump the transatlantic relationship in with that because they're so closely intertwined, although the transatlantic relationship also has to do with security. But the economic situation of the EU and the Eurozone has been gradually improving for the last couple of years, certainly not as quickly as they would like, and as quickly as the US had. But it does seem likely to continue to do so despite the shock of Brexit. It's important to remember that 6 of the top 10 most globally competitive economies are European countries. 7 of the top 25 are in Europe. So it's still an economic powerhouse. Even without Great Britain, the EU will be the largest single market in the world and one of the strongest economies overall as a union. There is currently projected to be about 2% growth this year, which would be the strongest year in a long time. But there are some problems looming. Trade policy has become a sticking point with the EU. They had a really hard time pushing through a common trade policy with Canada. They're now moving on to Singapore. And then there's TTIP, which was the great hope for Europe remaining competitive and Europe being able to kind of keep up and play ball. But it's very likely that the transatlantic trade and investment partnership is going to wither and die on the vine. The chances that the Trump administration are going to move forward on TTIP, or that even the Germans at this point would approve TTIP, are becoming, well, I don't think they're very good. Let's just say that. Donald Trump's America First policies and hostility to these kinds of large trade deals, I think, will probably sink it, although he is starting to understand that you can't negotiate trade deals with the individual member states. That's not actually allowed. So we'll see where it goes, but it promises to be a bit of a sticking point. And then, of course, that brings us to the transatlantic relationship, which is definitely in an interesting period. To be reliable and strong and sort of taken for granted, and it's certainly not in the last few months. Much depends on a few things. The Trump administration and their policies towards NATO, and that's not just about what happens on the American side, but whether the European members of NATO respond and start to make progress towards the 2% GDP on national defense goal that they have in order to maintain a NATO membership. The U.S.'s policy on international climate agreements. I haven't looked at the news today, so I don't know if he's made the announcement yet, if anybody else, but this sort of, the Europeans are discouraged by Americans backing out of leadership on climate change mitigation and dealing with it. I think that's going to be a big issue for them. And it's sort of like the U.S. kind of signaling to Europe that America could care less if everybody else is worried about the world. That's not their primary concern. So the other big issue, of course, is Russia and Crimea, and the relationship between the U.S. and Russia is probably the least important part of that. It's the relationship between Europe and Russia. In terms of security, in terms of trade, in terms of economic independence in the energy front, Europe still gets a lot of its oil from Russia, which has a lot of oil and gas. And that makes countries like Poland and other former Warsaw Pact members really nervous. And the Baltic states, who are small and tiny and really rely on NATO, are very nervous by the idea that perhaps they won't be defended should Putin get it in his mind that he really wants to try to take the Baltics over again. So these are all kind of these precarious situations. But still, I think this is where the EU can strengthen its position, and I would argue that this is where I think we already are seeing signs of that. This is a moment now, if the U.S. starts to kind of back down on their commitment to NATO, this is a moment where the EU can develop a common security and defense policy that might have some teeth. And if they're going to be asked to spend 2% of their gross domestic product on national defense, they're going to be able to put some teeth into it, right? They will likely make a big play for NATO and invest themselves more in it and therefore they will probably make their own position stronger as a global leader. And if the US is going to cede leadership in innovation to mitigate the effects of climate change and in defending democracy abroad, then the EU could step into that gap and likely will. I think this is what Angela Merkel was doing. I think that was her goal in her speech last Sunday when she said that Germany can't rely on foreign partners much longer, and she clearly meant us. I think this was a way not just of saying the US has let me down. I don't think that's the important part of it. I think that that's her saying this is our moment, and looking for Germany and, in fact, the EU, Europe more generally, to be new global leaders. So I think European identity could be strengthened through this vision of what the EU could be, a global leader that could be filling in for the more self-interested superpowers. So the outlook, I would say that, if we're looking at crises, well, out of adversity sometimes comes strength. The crises aren't over, but I think we've seen in past weeks and months hints of how the European Union could in fact be strengthened in the process of resolving the crisis. And so here are some things I want you to maybe think about if they interest you while you're in Brussels. When you talk to officials or people or men on the street, women on the street, what's the mood and the outlook of the people that you talk to? How do officials of the EU balance their national and their supranational identities? Are they more optimistic or pessimistic? And remember, they're going to be different from people who've not decided to work for the EU. And then Brussels, you're in a really interesting place, as some of you already know. Brussels is a really interesting city for thinking about what it means to be European. And Belgium is a fascinating country for thinking about identity, because it's all sorts of weird. So think about those things while you're there in that place. Think about what it means to integrate migrants versus assimilating them. And Brussels is a place where you can really see it. And if you go to any other country while you're there, like France, it's very different. And so it's really important to kind of think about these things. What is the role of language in forging a European identity? And you're going to be meeting lots of people who speak natively lots of different languages, but how do they negotiate that in their everyday interactions? And then you'll hear this a lot. But try to dig deep into your interactions with people when they start talking about the U.S. What is their attitude to the U.S. and how is it mediated and how is it moderated by what parts of our relationship you're talking about? And I think something that I like to tell people that you probably all already know because you're probably telling your students this all the time, but this is a good time to listen more than to talk to them because they've got a lot to say to us, I think, right now. I really look forward to seeing what you make of your time there, and thank you for your attention.